Good evening and welcome to Left, Right and Centre. I'm Nidhi Razdan. We woke up this morning to the news that retail inflation in December rose by 7.35%. That's the highest since July 2014. And it's mostly driven by higher prices of vegetables. This, many analysts believe, poses not just a big economic challenge for the Modi government, but also a political one. Because let's face it, people don't like it when onions and gobi cost more. Right now, vegetable prices have gone up by 60% since a year ago. Now, is this rise in inflation a transitory phase? Maybe. Or is there more to worry about? Yes, and this is why. GDP growth has already been projected to come down in this financial year to 5%. It was 6.8% last year. So when you combine high prices with slow growth and higher unemployment, it leads to what Dr. Manmohan Singh had warned about just months earlier, stagflation. The big fear is that since the inflation numbers exceed the comfort level that the central bank has of 4%, that's plus minus 2 percentage points, then it will probably not boost lower interest rates to boost economic growth. And that in turn could dampen economic sentiment even further. But here are some other key statistics that we need to look at as far as the state of the economy is concerned. The State Bank of India has just 24 hours ago come out with a report which says that slow growth is now having a visible impact on payroll creation, which means that in the next financial year, the number of new payrolls created will be approximately 16 lakhs less than last year. Meanwhile, passenger car sales have declined by more than 23% in the April to December period of 2019 when compared to the same period the previous year. But the government says there are some signs of good news. GST collection, they point out, has been more than 1 lakh crore for 2 consecutive months. The question, though, is that enough? Does it meet the government's targets? And the index of industrial production, called the IIP, actually turned positive in December after contracting for more than 3 months. So where are we as far as the state of the economy is concerned? Nirmala Sitharaman presents the budget in 2.5 weeks from now. We have with us on the program today, Dr. Ratin Roy, the Director of the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy, author, former advisor to the Prime Minister in his Economic Advisory Council. Ratin Roy, great to have you on the program. Let me start right away with what Dr. Manmohan Singh had said in November 2019 when he warned of this thing called stagflation. And he said, when a country goes into that territory of stagflation, it's a dangerous territory from which it becomes very hard for large economies to recover from. Are we there yet?
No. This particular rise in inflation, as you very correctly pointed out, is worrying, but stagflation happens when all prices across the board, not just food prices, tend to rise, I would say, economists differ, but for at least 4 to 6 quarters. And we're not in that territory yet. The consumer price index, which measures what people buy in the markets, has risen by 7.35%, and that is worrying. We'll come to that later, I guess, because the RBI has to target the consumer price index. It has chosen to target the consumer price index at up to 6%. But 80% of that rise in the CPI is because of food inflation. 80% of the rise in food inflation is because of vegetables, and 2/3 of the rise in vegetables prices is because of onions. So there's one commodity that is driving food price inflation. If you look at rice, wheat, cereals, etc., the picture is fairly benign.
They've also gone up, but not as much.
But not by as much. They have gone up. In fact, it's a
around
good thing.
15%, I think, for dal.
That's right.
For pulses.
Dal is actually the highest,
yeah.
But that is probably a good thing because you do want farmers' incomes to double. And therefore, if food becomes a little more expensive, it's okay. The problem with it is vegetable prices tend to be volatile. And they're volatile because our public systems that should be ensuring predictable delivery of these things in response to demand don't seem to be working anymore.
So are we going to see that change as far as food inflation is concerned? Do you see in the next few months vegetable prices coming down?
Yes, I do. I think this will
onions
moderate.
Certainly will probably come down.
It will certainly moderate. But the problem is that when you have volatility, then as you were saying earlier, it is very difficult for the central bank to be assured that this will not negatively impact its inflation target. And therefore, it is extremely unlikely that any responsible central bank would reduce interest rates because their theory is that they are able to control consumer price inflation, including food price inflation, by moving the repo rate up and down. So if they stick to the theory when times are good, then they have to stick to it when times are bad.
So what does that mean for reviving economic sentiment? Because it all comes back to that the mood is down, that we're down in the dumps, frankly, at the moment. So what will it take to revive economic sentiment if the bank also isn't willing to cut interest rates?
The bank has cut interest rates. I think the room for further cutting interest rates to revive economic sentiment is limited. What we need to do is improve transmission, and what we need to do is make sure that people lend money. Then you've got to ask the question, why are people not lending money? Arvind Subramanian has pointed to this twin balance sheet problem. He spoke at length, I think, to Prannoy on this channel.
Yeah.
But in addition to that, there is the problem that people are now afraid that they will be punished if they take risks. And by definition, lending is a risky business. So when your balance sheets are weak, then your propensity to take risks is low. So I think what needs to go out there is a clear signal, not just from the government, but also from industry as a whole, that risk appetite needs to improve, and only the improvement of risk appetite will lower risk.
How do you prove that risk appetite?
You improve the risk appetite by sending out clear signals that banks are now willing to lend.
But banks are being punished for lending.
That has to stop. And perhaps that has. But I don't think the bankers have been told that very clearly. You can't do these things on a note sheet. You have to go out there, meet with them, talk to them, and you have to provide evidence where risks have been taken, things that are not very good have happened, and that they have been backed by their owners, which in this country is the government of India.
So before I come back to the macro picture, just looking at some of the statistics before us. For instance, the State Bank of India's report on payroll that has just come out, that we were reading out those numbers, 16 lakh fewer new payrolls this year as compared to, the next financial year as compared to this one. What does that tell us? What does that mean?
That tells us that a phenomenon which has been going on now for quite some time, as the PLFS survey, Labour Force survey revealed, is accentuating. It is accentuating. Okay, so what's that phenomenon? Basically, when we were creating jobs, we were creating good jobs in industries and sectors which, as I've said frequently, including on your channel, only were fueled by the consumption of the top 150 million. Auto sales,
Yeah.
FMCG. So when these tank, good jobs tank. Good jobs have been tanking for a long time. So what we had earlier was a massive increase in construction demand for construction jobs. When good jobs tank and when the economic growth rate goes down, then the demand for those not so good jobs also goes down a little bit. Add to that the problem in the PLFS that our education system is not able to deliver efficiently, in the sense that the survey shows that your probability of getting a job is lower the more educated you are. If you're a postgraduate, your chance of getting a job is lower than if you're a graduate. So what this payroll thing that the State Bank of India is talking about is this much touted formal economy is actually very adversely affected by this economic slowdown, and that is impacting jobs, which will now further impact demand, and that is not a good thing.
So the informal sector, let's not even go there then, if this is the impact on the formal economy.
We don't know what is going to happen in the informal sector, because I'm quite encouraged by the uptick in the IIP. So it could well be the case that the informal sector payroll will expand moderately as long as credit offtake is there and things are done to make their life easier.
So can I ask you sort of this question, that when you look at the state of the economy today, how much of it does the government need to be blamed for, and how much of this is by the much talked about global factors, or is it a bit of both?
But government is not the economy.
But they're running the economy.
And they don't run the economy. We're not a communist country. So we've got to ask ourselves, what is inhibiting the private sector, consumers, households and firms of participating more in the economy? And there I think we have a structural problem, that the people who participate in delivering growth have essentially belonged to the top 15%, maybe 20% of our population. We need to broad base that participation. And that means, for example, that means that industrialists who are in their comfort zones investing in South Gujarat and in Tamil Nadu and in the South have to start finding ways to create industry and employment opportunities in North India. Government on its part needs to make sure that they are able to facilitate that. Consumers that we try and seduce into doing more, we have to realize are people who are earning the minimum wage and twice the minimum wage, not people earning 10 times the minimum wage who buy Maruti cars. So it has to be a joint effort between government and industry to solve the structural problem. That being said, I'm talking about an economy that we all want to grow at 7% plus. The immediate problem we have is, my estimate is that without doing too much on the lines I've been talking about, the economy should be growing at 6%.
When?
So on any given day, I don't think international factors are serious enough to warrant a sub 6% growth. The first thing we need to do next year is get a growth up to 6%. And we can do that in addition to the factors I mentioned in terms of improving the sort of risk perception environment by increasing purchasing power and consumer spending. That can be done, of course, by the government using both fiscal and monetary policy or either, but can also be done by the private sector being willing to try and seduce consumers in to buying what their inventories are stockpiling up by offering lower prices in the confidence that they'll make it up in the long run.
What worries you the most about the economy today? Very simply, you have, we get thrown with all these statistics at us, and some of them are very contradictory as well, because you hear about, low growth, and then you see the Sensex has, hit an 11,000-year high and all that. So what do we make of these numbers? If there was something that worried you the most about the economy today, what would it be? Is it just the GDP numbers or something else?
The headline thing that worries me about our economy today is a social problem, which is that the PLFS reported that there are 100 million Indians who are neither in between the ages of 15 and 40, who are neither in full-time education nor even looking for a job. That is a very serious number, because that means in effect you have written off 10% of India's total population and a larger proportion of India's young population. We have to ask ourselves why this has happened, and again I repeat, jobs and economic activity that has fueled growth since 1991 has taken place, with the exception of this bubble around Delhi, in southern and western India. There are pockets there where it has not happened, but any growth that has happened there. It has not happened in UP, Bihar, Jharkhand and Chhattisgarh, where the majority of the people live. Yeah. So what worries me about the economy, has been worrying me about some time, if we're talking medium term, is that India is not growing where the majority of Indians live. Therefore, the majority of Indians cannot participate in growth unless they emigrate to other parts of the country under very insecure circumstances. There is no way, for example, in the old days, when you had Bihari labor going to Punjab, that you could claim that Bihar's prosperity would go up as a consequence of that. So we are not sharing our historic prosperity, and we need to come up with an economic model that allows production and consumption to be more widely dispersed in the hinterland of India to keep our growth stable.
But so, you've been on the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. You're not there anymore. So maybe perhaps you can be more frank now. And does this government listen to advice, very frankly? Because that's one of the criticisms, that you create these advisory bodies, but they're not actually listening. Do they listen?
The government listens to the advice that it chooses to seek.
So that answers the question.
I think so.
That it chooses to seek. When you see, though, in the run-up to this budget, one of the interesting things that has happened is the fact that the finance minister is nowhere to be seen. I mean, Nirmala Sitharaman has not been seen in key meetings in recent weeks. There was a Niti Aayog meeting that the Prime Minister, Amit Shah, Nitin Gadkari, they were all there. Piyush Goyal was there. Nirmala Sitharaman wasn't there. What do you make of the criticism that she's getting? Do you think it's unfair that she's sort of being scapegoated in all of this? The responsibility has to be taken at the top, or does she, share the blame as well for the way things are?
No, that's a party political matter that is between the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister. As an economist, I do not tend to comment on personalities or their presence or absence at meetings. So I would wonder whether the Niti Aayog meeting was indeed that important. I don't know.
Well, if Amit Shah and the Prime Minister are there, it would be.
The arrival of personalities, unlike a cocktail party, does not make a meeting important in terms of, making a difference to how the economy functions. So in a sense, I would be very pleased if the Finance Minister has decided that her priority, I don't know, is to present a budget which I believe ought to be focusing first and foremost to improve the credibility of the government and the economy on transparency and predictability.
No, so I was going to ask you that next. What really would you like to see from the budget? And it's going to be very difficult. Would the government actually have to further breach its fiscal deficit targets in order, basically spend more in order to get growth revived? Do you think they're going to do that? Just your thoughts.
The first thing we need from this budget is honesty and transparency, which was not forthcoming in the last budget.
In what way?
It is not acceptable that when the government knows that its tax GDP ratio is 1% lower than the numbers being reported in the budget, it goes ahead and reports numbers that are higher. On grounds of what, I don't know. As you know, last year I pointed out that our tax GDP ratios were 1% lower, according to the government's own accounts, which were available because it was July, than the provisional estimates. It is, even if the government chooses to borrow and not take that borrowing as part of the fiscal deficit, it should say so openly and transparently. It's odd that last year's budget, in different parts of it, the government did say that some of its borrowing, what's called off budget, would not be part of the fiscal deficit, but it was scattered across budget documents. Why? I think what will instill confidence in the government's credibility the most is to have a budget which, when I get up on budget day and read, I can say this is an honest budget. That is why.
Are you saying that they've been dishonest with numbers?
I'm saying that they have not been fully transparent with numbers in the last budget. I said so in print, and I think I said so on your channel. The provisional accounts for last year showed the tax GDP ratio being a whole 1% of GDP lower than was reported in the revised estimates. These numbers were available to the budget makers in July last year, but they chose to go with the revised estimates. That doesn't work anymore. In this modern world, there are plenty of people who are minutely examining these things, and these things will out as they have. And that destroys government credibility, and therefore they must come back to the path where they say, look, we couldn't collect the taxes we sought to collect, so here's the problem. That means, sorry, fewer SOPs for you and fewer write-offs. We have cut indirect taxes, and this is the hit we have taken on revenue. That's on the revenue side. On the expenditure side, absolutely. If the government wants to spend more money, it can borrow more with my blessing, with one important rider. I would like to see a very clear account of every additional rupee borrowed, where that is going to be spent, when that is going to create results. And I want accountability for that 6 months down the line, because the worst thing you can do is borrow more money and fritter it away. So if the government can show me, to my satisfaction personally speaking, that the incremental borrowing they're planning to do, and that's not just saying we'll spend it on infrastructure. What infrastructure? Have you got the land? Is the project ready? I was hoping that
Was that part of the problem in the budget too last year?
No, all budgets are normally like that, but these are bad days. These are days when the government is extremely fiscally constrained. And
so you need to be more specific.
Yeah, so for example, if the government said, I would cheerlead it, they won't do it. But if they said, I'm going to borrow 0.5% of GDP more, and you know what? Because the states are closer to the people, I'm going to give this money to the states, maybe with some conditions, and tell them to spend the money because they're closer to the people. I would say, now this is useful. But if the central government is going to do it, the central government does not hire doctors, road cleaners, municipal sweepers, right? If the central government is going to do it, I want to know what you're doing with every rupee of that money.
When you speak about the need for greater transparency in the budget, that brings us to the larger question also of our own data. I mean, today, there are people around the world asking whether we've gone the China way and are inflating our numbers, or we are also cherry picking, frankly, the data we want to put out, the data we want to own up to, whether it's on jobs or anything else. And is that part of a bigger credibility problem that we are facing as a country?
We need to pay very careful attention to the data issue. It cannot be the case that we have the National Statistical Organization bringing out a report, let's say on poverty, and that report is then sort of postponed for 2 years without a clear explanation. We cannot have multiple entities commenting on Indian statistics. I do not understand what the role of the Niti Aayog is, for example, in commenting on Indian statistics. But we also need to understand that our statistical offices are extremely professional organizations. The appointment of Dr. Pranab Sen to look at the entire data issue, I think, is a very good thing. And the good news, finally, is that all that is true for real economy data, perhaps. Fiscal data, I'll put my professional opinion on, is impeccable. Its presentation and its deployment, I think, may be unsatisfactory in many cases, and that is sad because I don't know why government thinks. There are analysts all over the world, not just me, who know how to look at fiscal data. You try and present things that are not credible, you will be found out, and that is much worse for you.
But is it a good sign that you have people like Pranab Sen now who are on board, that the government has taken them on board? They've been known critics of the way the government has handled data and so on, that maybe they're willing to sort of go beyond their echo chambers and
I think so. I think that the appointment of that committee shows me that at least within the professional community there is a consensus that we need to re-establish or further enhance the credibility of India's data system. So I look forward to what that report will come out with.
Another thing we need to talk about is you talked about the social problem as far as the economy is concerned and the lack of sort of good jobs as well, educated people looking for good jobs, etc. But we're also in the middle of another kind of social problem. I mean, the protests that we're seeing, the unrest over the Citizenship Act, the NRC, etc. Now, how does that affect economic sentiment? It's a genuine question. There was an interesting story the other day about how, I mean, these car makers are saying that we've had lower footfalls in our, lower sales have gone down. Even already they were bad, they're even worse. And so there is a way that it's impacting restaurants, those, businesses, etc. So how does all of this affect our economy?
Social unrest, for whatever cause, obviously is bad for any economy. It's bad for foreign investor sentiment. It's bad for risk-taking. And when that social unrest is spearheaded by the relatively young in the population, one has to also read between the lines and see whether that unrest also sparks a deep insecurity about their futures, because this is the young we are talking about. So I think we need to reassure the young that their economic futures are secure, and to do that we need to take those medium-term structural steps. If you tell me at my age that I'm going to do things that is going to make the Indian economy strong in 5 years, I'm not going to be as excited as a 21-year-old. For a 21-year-old, it's very exciting. The data that I gave you, that the more educated you are, the less likely you are to get a job that came out of the labor force survey, is a terribly depressing thing for youth, because then you're telling them that the education is not going to be a pathway to economic security. We are also, I think, making a mistake by this constant insisting that students must only study. Students have to engage in society and in public life, apart from, getting the specializers that they get. That is not the privilege of some minority elite. And therefore, if we do that, then you get a more inclusive society, because people feel more included. When people feel more included, they talk to each other. When they talk to each other, they learn, and that is how you participate, whether in the polity or in society or in the economy. Creating divisions and telling people what they should and should not be doing on, I think, fairly spurious claims that public money is being spent on them, I think is a terrible sentiment, and it must stop.
And it affects economic sentiment, domestically and as you say, foreign investors too.
It affects economic sentiment domestically, it affects economic sentiment, I think, internationally, because unless you're an oil producer or something, a monopoly oil producer, your risk officers will perceive risk in a situation such as we have been seeing over the past couple of months, and we have to collectively as a society address it, because we must understand and listen to the voices of India's future, which are young people. Now, if I am told that I am wrong and that this is only a vocal minority and the majority of India's young are content, then I would ask you, then how I would find that difficult to believe that there are 100 million people between the ages of 18 and 40 who are neither looking for work nor in full-time education. Now, this is not a new phenomenon. This is a cross-party phenomenon, because that number was 60 million about 6 years ago, 60 or 65, but it keeps going up. So this is not a conjecture and moment problem. This is a long-term problem. And I will ask you why and what hope I can give a young person when the data shows me that if they go into education, they're less likely to get a decent job. These issues have to be addressed, and we have to build confidence in India 2024, and that is not going to come by not having a conversation with those who are going to be an integral part of building that confidence, which is people who are going to be young adults in 2024.
I think that's a good note to end on, Ratan Roy. Thank you very much for coming in. I hope that the government is listening to that, because we've been saying that as well. Talk to the young people, talk to the students, talk to those who are protesting. Don't talk at them, talk to them. But thanks very much for coming in this evening. Thank you.
Thank you.